Two British Columbia lawyers are facing accusations of genocide denial and racism for daring to suggest that the BC Law Society correct a mandatory Indigenous sensitivity training manual. The correction? That 215 bodies have not been found at the site of the former Indian residential school on the Kamloops Indian Reservation. They wanted to add the word potentially to this claim, which is in line with what the Kamloops Indian Residential School Band themselves say, but by daring to suggest that correction, both lawyers, Jim Heller and Mark Barry, have faced accusations of racism. Well, joining us now on the show is Jim Heller, one of the two lawyers. Jim, thank you so much for joining us, and take us through what has happened here, because reading this story in the National Post, I really couldn't believe it.
Right. Thanks for your interest. And first, at the risk of having you somehow stigmatized as a denialist, I have to say the claim was 215, not
15, got it.
214. Okay, so anyways. Okay, so basically what happens is I think everybody, anyone that's going to watch this show likely, and probably any Canadian and maybe anybody in California, perhaps even Uruguay, should know that on May 27th, 2021, there was an incredibly explosive report that was issued by the Kamloops band, the Indigenous band in Kamloops, in conjunction, I think, with the government at that point, saying that they had found, through ground-penetrating radar, they'd found the remains of 215 children that had been students at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. So there's an apple orchard outside of the old school. The school's been closed for some time now, but apparently through GPR, ground-penetrating radar research or examination, they'd found these 215 kids. And that was amazing. That was like staggering. It seared the Canadian conscience. It just riveted the world. I think it immediately became an issue at the United Nations. Suddenly Canada is being considered in a way that's never been considered before. Suddenly we're a genocidal country. Our Prime Minister directed that the flags across the country should be lowered. They stayed lowered for months on this basis. Hundreds of churches over 100 churches, I believe, were vandalized and or arsoned. All as a result. The anger was amazing, the shock and the shame. So anyways, all right, that all happened 3.5 years ago. And I think that immediately when people heard that, I know that when I first heard that, I felt all of that. And the thing is that people immediately suspected that we're going to find out more about this. We're going to get to the truth of this soon. Everybody wanted that truth. We wanted to know with certainty what exactly was what. I mean, it sounded like we knew right at the outset, but then it became kind of clear that, well, wait a sec, it wasn't completely conclusive. So when that became known, we all wanted to know what happened, what the story was. I don't think anybody would have thought that over 3 years later, there still has been no excavation on that site, and we don't know for a fact what, if any, there are any bodies there, if there are 214 or 215 or 200. In fact, that 215 assessment was immediately dropped down to 200, but that seems to get lost and mixed a little bit. So anyways, that happened. And then we just kind of, life proceeded. There was lots of fallout from that report and the assumption that it was valid and accurate. But what happened most immediately, and the reason that we're talking right now is this. In February 23, there was a woman that was convicted of criminal contempt of court here in British Columbia on the basis of, she was a pipeline protester and she was Indigenous. And she went to court for sentencing for contempt of court. And at her sentencing, her lawyer, in informing the court about some of her Indigenous heritage factors, which is something that all Indigenous offenders have taken into consideration for themselves, and that's part of our law now in Canada. Her lawyer started talking about the remains of these 215 kids that had been unearthed in Kamloops, and the judge, the sentencing judge, kind of stopped at one point and said, "Well, wait a sec, that didn't happen." And they had an exchange back and forth, and the judge finally settled on their potential. These are potential unmarked graves. And when she did that, the courtroom exploded. And all of this woman's followers started calling out to the judge, calling her a racist, a denialist. I hate that term, but that's the term that they were using. They had to be taken out of the courtroom by the sheriff. So one might think that'd be the end of it, but it wasn't. What happened afterwards was that same lawyer went to the Court of Appeal, and he appealed her sentence on the basis that the judge had made those comments, and therefore the judge was biased. Therefore, the judge was biased against his client and all of that. So then the Court of Appeal, and it's 3 judges, they considered that issue. And they came down with a ruling on July 22nd. And on July 22nd, they issued a ruling that was penned by the Chief Justice of our court in British Columbia. His name is Len Marchand, and he, in fact, is Indigenous himself. And he very carefully considered what happened at the sentencing, and he basically said this. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the band itself now at this point, they speak in terms of a contingency. They say these are potential unmarked graves. So how could it have been wrong for the judge herself to have done that? And so he dismissed the appeal, said there was nothing wrong with that. So then what I did, I thought, that's not good. That's not good that lawyer might have taken the same training. Oh, well, wait a sec, we're not at the training yet. So this is what happened. In our training that we have, this mandatory Indigenous training that we have, we are told that they did discover 215 children's bodies at that site, and that in fact the band had known that all along, and anyways, that's inaccurate. So I wrote to the trainers and I said, "Hey, look at this decision. I think it's incumbent upon you to change things," and they didn't get back to me. So I wrote them again and said, "What's happening? Why aren't you getting back to me? Your facility for feedback and commentary and all that is email. You're supposed to get back to me. You said that you would within 2 days. They didn't." So I wrote them a third time. And once again, I said, what's going on? This is like a serious, important issue. You should correct the training, please. I thought it was a fair email, but once again, they didn't get back to me. So I brought a resolution with a colleague of mine, Mark Berry, and we brought a resolution to the membership of the profession. We have an annual general meeting, and this resolution was that the Law Society do what I was asking the trainers to do, which was just modify the training to make it comport with our current state of knowledge. So brought the resolution, and we have like a discussion period before the AGM. It's about a month long. But during that period, lots of different things happen. The Law Society itself slammed us. It came out with a gratuitous press release saying that we were racist. So, well, what it said was that our resolution showed that there's a lot of racism left in the profession that needs to be rooted out. And obviously, they're implying that we were racist.
Yeah.
And saying that our resolution was frivolous, vexatious, and unnecessary. And, lots of other...
Unnecessary. I mean, it's ridiculous to say unnecessary when you're correcting a factual inaccuracy. Like, of course it's necessary. If it's a mandatory training and people are being told something that isn't true, it's necessary to correct that, you would think.
You would think that, but let me tell you some of the arguments against this. It's really kind of fascinating. And it's all kind of on this whole, I guess, woke, unwoke axis. It all falls along those lines. So some of the feedback that we got, either kind of criticism at the AGM or in the Law Society portal where they open up a discussion page beforehand, or other press releases that the BC First Nations and the BC Civil Liberties Union and the Canadian Bar Association, they all put out. One of the arguments that they made was that, you know what, even if it's inaccurate, this is like unseemly. Like, you don't go against the oppressed narrative, regardless if it's accurate or not. Like, for example, I said that there's an issue as to whether or not even the claim was 200 or 215. Right off the bat, the woman that did the GPR study was told about at least one little area that 15 of the anomalies that she thought could be bodies weren't. It was clear that they weren't. So she brought it back down to 200. But somehow nobody seems to have taken account of that. So that's why training says 215. So anyways, some of the criticism we got was like, it's unseemly. You're not Indigenous. It's not your story. It's not your narrative. These aren't your facts. Anyways, okay, let's talk about my perspective here. I'm a lawyer. I think that we should deal with things as lawyers. We're evidence oriented. Sometimes we get into the pick a uni kind of details on a granular basis, and sometimes it really matters, and really important decisions hang in the balance. Someone could be convicted of murder and spend the rest of his life in jail because of that. Was it 1 inch or 2 inches? That kind of an assessment. We should be looking at this issue through that same lens, perhaps more than any other kind of part of society. I think that's incumbent upon us as lawyers to do that. And we weren't doing that, and we're not doing that. Anyways, what happened was, despite all of that horrible, unnecessary, I would say not just spurious, but defamatory pushback that we got, we still got 48%. 48% of the lawyers were willing to kind of vote, and the Law Society would know who they were because all the votes are anonymous, maybe to the membership, but not to the Law Society. We're willing to say, you know what? They should change that training. Just change it. Not a big deal.
Yeah. And so
thanks for letting me talk on and on and on. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I want to give you this chance because the problem we have, Jim, that I see is that not only did you experience this, you and your colleague experienced this pushback at the legal profession, but in the media profession. We can't have certain conversations without being labeled as racist and denialist. And you and your colleague were labeled publicly by the BC First Nations Justice Council, I believe, as being genocide deniers.
Yeah.
Now, racist genocide deniers. You're not a racist, are you, Jim?
I don't think so.
And also, in the chat portal, I believe, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but the BC Lawyers Association, they had to shut down the chat portal because of the abuse that you and Mark were receiving from other lawyers?
Well, okay, that's an interesting thing. So we have this portal, and we're getting some support, and then we're getting a lot of pushback from lawyers that are making these kinds of arguments, the same arguments they made at the AGM. And in fact, the AGM is available as a YouTube video. Someone could watch it. For example, it's not our story. It's not our issue. And by the way, I really disagree with that. I think that we all, as Canadians, own this story. The purported victims of the story own the story, and the purported people that are associated with the dominant culture in society that might have perpetrated these crimes, if in fact they took place, they own the story too. We all own the story. Anyways, we were told it's not our story, not ours to even speak to. We were told that we must be coming at this with some sort of a black heart, bad faith motive to try to embarrass the band or to try to undermine the momentum of the general idea of truth and reconciliation, all of that. And but anyways, that carried on for a while until, here's my theory. The Law Society didn't explain why they shut it down. They just said that these were intemperate comments. What I think happened was that there was one person in particular that cited the Law Society's denunciation of us and said, well, the Law Society says that you're racist. Maybe you should be subject to some sort of professional conduct disciplinary accusation. And at that point, I think the Law Society took note of the Frankenstein that they had created, and I thought that maybe is a bridge too far, and they shut it down. But in shutting it down, what they were doing was derailing the entire AGM resolution voting process, because we needed that portal, arguably, to kind of, canvas ideas and stuff. So they derailed that, and they kind of, well, nonetheless, like I say, we got 48% of the vote.
Right. And
then soon after,
yeah,
it's got to be said, we have this member of parliament, Leah Gazan, is that her name? The NDP member of parliament tabled a resolution in parliament to actually criminalize anybody raising an eyebrow against anything that anyone says it's kind of part of that anti-dominant society narrative with respect to residential schools. Sorry, go.
Well, I mean, you're exactly right, because that legislation, this residential school denialism legislation that Leah Gazan proposed, would criminalize repeating what has been written in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, right? It would make it illegal to say, to repeat the positive experiences from the residential school system, which were published in that report. Besides that point, I want to ask you this.
Yeah.
What does the action that has been taken by the BC First Nations Justice Council and the Law Society of British Columbia, what do you think this does to benefit the lives of Indigenous Canadians, if anything at all?
Oh man, that's such a great and fundamental question. It gets so lost in the mix in all of this. And what does it do to our courts? I think there's a... Let's
do both. Yeah.
First, the Indigenous communities of Canada themselves. So can you imagine you're raising a kid who's young. He was too young to even know about the announcement was first made 3 years ago. So maybe he's like 8 years old, 9 years old. And now you're telling him, or he's hearing about it from others, about these 215 children that are buried outside this residential school. That's like, I'm not a big horror movie fan, but isn't that kind of like the Amityville horrors or something like that? You're raising these kids with these horror stories. How can that be, if it's not true? And I'm not saying one way or the other. There could be bodies there. There could be bodies in some other, outside some other residential school. There could have been something very nefarious done. I don't know. I mean, I don't think my own views on that are really that important. I'm doing my own reading about that. I'm trying to learn what I can about it. I did read Unmarked Graves, which is a book that is nothing but some very thoughtful, studious essays by serious people like retired judges and academics in the country. But nonetheless, my opinion notwithstanding, we're telling these kids that this is a fact. How can that be good for them? How can that be good for their relations with others? I don't think it's a good thing at all. I've got a number of Indigenous clients, and I think I've got a really good rapport with them. And I've told them about this resolution, and for what it's worth, they actually they understand it. They support it. So I don't think it's good that we're doing that. That whole denialism thing is terrible, horrible. I'm Jewish. I lost a lot of family in the Holocaust. I'm not happy about even our criminalization of stupid talk, Holocaust denialism. But at least I see a distinction here. So in that same decision, the Court of Appeal decision that came down July 22nd, it's called R.V. Dick. Her name is Miranda Dick. Justice Marchand rightfully noted that a good definition of denialism, a recent coinage, I would imagine, I guess, is that it's like resistance or kind of denial, non-acceptance of a well-established fact. So if, for example, they were to excavate and they were to find these bodies, and we knew that, then you've got your well-established fact. And there's still going to be people, I would imagine, because it's a big world out there, they're going to say, I don't think that's real. I think that video footage that they're showing us of those remains that they've shown now at this horribly solemn terrible press conferences. I'm just saying, imagine hypothetically
Yeah.
they did that. I think that those are fake. I think the whole thing's fake. Like the moon landing is fake. That would be, I think then you're venturing into this kind of crazy, irrational realm that you can start calling denialism. But when it's people that are saying, why don't you just do the work? Why don't you, like, let's see the reasons to think that maybe these reports might be valid, maybe not,
Right.
why don't we just do the work? So now that's what I think it has, the impact it has on Indigenous communities in Canada generally. I want to say about the legal system. So I think it's really bad to do this. One of the things that the people have done, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, is they've kind of tried to boost up the credibility of claims to an exceptional level that they're not subject to scrutiny. And I think that's really bad. So, for example, let's say that they did excavation and they found some remains and they're able to do some meaningful forensic work, and they ultimately charge someone, and that person's still alive. They're like an 85-year-old former priest from the Kamloops Residential School, and he gets charged. And let's say he hires me and I'm his lawyer. It's still okay to be his lawyer, isn't it? Well, let's just assume that.
Yeah.
Well, then at that point, if some of the case against him is going to be premised on live witness testimony, what's called viva voce testimony from witnesses, and they bring someone forward that says that I was told, and it's got a hearsay problem, but nonetheless, I was told by someone that they had to wake up in the middle of the night and they dug a hole, and that's being used. At that point, whether it's me or whoever, that lawyer is going to be cross-examining that witness. And that witness's credibility, maybe their sincerity, maybe their sincerity, or maybe just their reliability. Maybe they're sincere, but maybe their accuracy is going to be subject to scrutiny, and it will be tested. And you will not have a judge telling the jury in that case, hey, listen, this is an Indigenous witness, so you have to treat their evidence different than you would that cop's evidence. No. They're a human being, and their evidence gets challenged and tested like any other human beings. But the ban now, sadly, the bans and all of the woke agencies like our beloved Law Society, British Columbia Law Society, they've kind of fallen into this really kind of sad indulgence that might feel good, but it's not good for the law and it's not good for anybody, where they're saying, hold on, you have to believe, you have to accept the whatever the account, of these people. And I'm sorry, man, it's just not like that. We live in a society with the rule of law, and that's how we try to get to the truth. And the truth still matters, I think. Those might be my final words as I face execution, for my denialism, for giving this interview. Hey, do you really have to air this? I've got dependents. I've got people that I'm just kidding.
The truth does matter, and it's important to say it. It's important to challenge it. And I find it shocking, really, that the BC Law Society would take such an opposing stance to the Chief Justice of the BC Superior Court. It's unbelievable. Yeah, we're going to say.
Can I say one further thing? Because I just feel we're kind of we're kind of like pushing the envelope on time-wise. So I just want to say one further thing. I think it's interesting, not just on this issue, but on any issue where there's kind of like a easily identifiable kind of victim group. And in this case, definitely the Indigenous people are the victims here. And I'm not saying that they're not victims. I'm not saying that they have not been disempowered. I mean, obviously, the history of Canada, this was at one point, they were the only people here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But generally, when it comes to woke groups where you have woke issues, where you have disadvantaged groups, here's what society has to do. We have to get to a point where those disadvantaged narratives and things that they say are still correctable, because that's the problem here.
Yeah.
We think that they can't be corrected. Like, for example, Black Lives Matter. Michael, what was his name? Wilson? Can't remember. The guy that supposedly said hands up, don't shoot. Well, we know that he didn't say hands up, don't shoot. But the narrative was so brittle, there was no room for correction.
Yeah.
And so with all of these things, there has to be room for correction. I think that's what I've butted up against here. The idea that the bands is so fragile, they've been so disadvantaged, so disempowered that they can't be corrected. I don't think that's true. I think there's room for all of it. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Correct, strengthen, reaffirm, reevaluate your position, maybe shift 2 degrees to the left, 2 degrees to the right. That's life. That's how we should interact with one another. No narrative
Absolutely.
is beyond reproach.
Absolutely. And no matter what it is, getting to the truth and making the truth stand on its own, and not, not pushing lies and mistruths as though it's gospel and factual, is absolutely critical in every profession. So, Jim, thank you for speaking to us. Thank you for sharing this story. And I really feel like it is one that is, I don't think you're going to be the only person to be labeled racist for trying to correct this narrative. I've been labeled racist, and I think many other people who do stick their necks out on the line for the truth will end up with that same label.
Well, we're not done yet. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Thanks for your interest. Thanks for your time. And yeah. Okay. Thanks, man.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jim.